Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist, or is he just a figure of legend? For centuries, historians, skeptics, and believers have debated this question, searching for evidence in ancient texts, archaeology, and historical records. In this video, we dive deep into the historical sources, Roman historians, Jewish chroniclers, and early Christian writings, to separate fact from faith. From the letters of Paul to the accounts of Tacitus and Josephus, we examine what scholars really say about Jesus' life, teachings, and crucifixion. Join us as we explore the fascinating historical evidence behind one of history's most influential figures. The question of whether Jesus of Nazareth truly existed is one of the most debated topics in history, theology, and cultural discourse. Millions around the world accept Jesus as both divine and historical, yet skeptics and scholars alike have long questioned the evidence for his actual life. Separating myth from history requires a careful examination of available sources, both Christian and non-Christian, as well as an understanding of the historical context in which he lived. This investigation does not attempt to answer matters of faith or theology, but seeks to address the historical question. Was there a man named Jesus who lived in the first century and whose life inspired the movement that became Christianity? 1. Understanding the historical question. When discussing Jesus historically, it is important to distinguish between theological claims and verifiable historical data. Claims about miracles, resurrection, or divinity fall into the realm of faith, whereas historians focus on facts that can be substantiated by multiple sources. The historical question is simpler. Did a Jewish teacher named Jesus of Nazareth exist? And did he live, preach, and get crucified in Judea under Roman rule? Interestingly, most scholars, whether secular or religious, agree that Jesus existed as a historical figure. The debate is not usually about his existence, but about the nature of his life, the accuracy of the gospel accounts, and how much of what is told about him is theological interpretation versus historical fact. 2. Non-Christian sources about Jesus. One of the strongest arguments for Jesus' existence comes from non-Christian sources that mention him indirectly, written by historians and chroniclers who had no vested interest in promoting Christianity. These sources include A. Tacitus, c. 56 to 120 CE. Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian, wrote in his annals that Christus, the founder of the Christians, suffered under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. Tacitus's account is especially important because he was highly critical of Christians, and there is no reason to suspect he would fabricate a figure to favor them. This mention, dated to roughly 116 CE, provides independent confirmation from outside the Christian tradition. B. Josephus, 37 to 100 CE. Josephus, a Jewish historian, provides two references to Jesus in his work Antiquities of the Jews. One passage, called the Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man and miracle worker who was crucified under Pilate. Scholars note that Christian scribes likely added some embellishments, but the consensus is that the original text did refer to Jesus. Another, more subtle reference describes James as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, which supports the existence of Jesus as a historical person. See Pliny the Younger, c. 61 to 113 CE. In a letter to Emperor Trajan, Pliny the Younger describes early Christian worship practices, noting that Christians revered Christ as a divine figure. While this does not provide biographical details, it confirms that Jesus was regarded as a historical figure by his followers within a generation of his death. D. Suetonius, c. 69 to 122 CE. Suetonius, a Roman historian, refers to disturbances caused by Chrestus in Rome during the reign of Claudius. Scholars generally interpret this as a reference to Christ, indicating that the existence of Jesus, or at least his followers, had observable effects beyond Judea. These independent sources are significant because they converge on a central point. There was a man named Jesus whose life and execution had enough impact to be noted by contemporary or near-contemporary historians. 3. Early Christian sources. The New Testament, while written by believers, is also a vital source for historians. These texts provide insight into both the life of Jesus and the earliest Christian communities. A. Paul's letters, c. 50 to 60 CE. Paul's letters are some of the earliest writings in the Christian tradition, predating the Gospels by at least 20 years. In his letters, Paul references Jesus as a real person, emphasizing his crucifixion and resurrection. He mentions Jesus' family and associates, which historians interpret as signs of a genuine historical context. Importantly, Paul writes within living memory of Jesus' life, making it less likely that the figure was purely mythical. B. The Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. The Gospels were written between roughly 70 and 100 CE. While they are theological texts meant to inspire faith, they also contain historical details about first-century Judea, such as political tensions under Roman rule, Jewish customs, geography, and social structures. Scholars treat the Gospels critically, comparing them with external sources and archaeological findings to extract historical facts. For example, the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is widely accepted as historically reliable due to multiple attestations. 4. Mythicist arguments. Despite the evidence, some scholars and writers argue that Jesus never existed as a historical person and that Christianity was built around a mythic figure. These mythicists often cite similarities between Jesus' story and earlier myths, such as dying and rising gods Osiris, Mithras, Dionysus. The mythicist position, however, faces several challenges. Multiple independent attestations. Unlike purely mythical figures, Jesus is referenced in multiple sources outside Christian texts. Specific historical context. Jesus is placed in a particular time, location, and political environment. Myths rarely include such precise historical markers. Crucifixion. Inventing a crucifixion, a humiliating Roman execution, would be unlikely if the intent was to create a purely glorified Messiah figure. Because of these points, the majority of historians reject the idea that Jesus was entirely fictional. 5. Archaeological context. Archaeology cannot prove Jesus' existence directly, but it provides context that supports the gospel narratives. Excavations in Galilee, Jerusalem, and other parts of Judea reveal the social, religious, and political environment described in the New Testament. Synagogues, Roman administrative buildings, crucifixion sites, and common Jewish practices of the first century all match the setting of Jesus' ministry. While this evidence does not confirm every gospel claim, it reinforces the plausibility of a real historical figure in that context. 6. Scholarly consensus. Modern historians, both secular and religious, tend to agree on several points. Jesus of Nazareth existed as a historical person. He was a Jewish teacher or preacher in Galilee and Judea. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, likely around 30 CE. His life and execution inspired the early Christian movement. Where scholars diverge is primarily on interpretation. The miracles, the resurrection, and theological claims about divinity are outside the realm of purely historical inquiry. 7. Why the debate continues. Despite the strong historical consensus, debates persist for several reasons. Religious implications. If Jesus did not exist, Christianity would lose its historical foundation, making the question emotionally and culturally charged. Silence in some sources. Not every historian of the era mentions Jesus. Some skeptics point to these omissions to question his existence. Mythicist appeal. The idea of a mythical Jesus is compelling to some because it offers a simple explanation for the origins of a global religion. Complexity of ancient sources. Historical documentation from the 1st century is sparse, leading to interpretation disputes. Nonetheless, the evidence we do have is substantial enough for historians to affirm Jesus' existence with a high degree of confidence. 8. Why history matters. Understanding Jesus historically is important, even for those of faith. Separating historical facts from theological interpretation helps us understand the socio-political context of early Christianity. Recognize the challenges faced by early followers in Judea and the Roman Empire. Appreciate how one individual's life and teachings could inspire a movement that reshaped history. History does not answer theological questions like divinity or resurrection, but it provides a firm foundation for understanding the world in which Christianity emerged. Understanding the historical Jesus. The question of whether Jesus of Nazareth really existed is not just a matter of religious interest, but also a historical inquiry into one of the most influential figures in human history. The historical evidence overwhelmingly supports the reality of Jesus as a person who lived in 1st century Judea, preached a message that attracted followers, and was executed under Roman authority. To fully appreciate this conclusion, we must explore the sources that inform our understanding, the scholarly approach to historical analysis, and the broader significance of recognizing the historical Jesus apart from theological claims. 1. The importance of distinguishing history from faith. When discussing Jesus, it is crucial to differentiate between matters of faith and matters of history. Believers often focus on questions of divinity, miracles, and resurrection, claims that belong to theology and spiritual interpretation. Historians, by contrast, ask a simpler but no less significant question. Did a man named Jesus exist in the historical record? And what do we know about him based on evidence? By separating these domains, it becomes possible to examine Jesus in a way that is both rigorous and impartial, acknowledging the evidence without assuming theological conclusions. The significance of establishing a historical Jesus lies in understanding how human events shape religious, cultural, and social developments. Acknowledging Jesus as a historical figure allows scholars to trace the origins of Christianity, the socio-political dynamics of 1st century Judea, and the profound influence that a single individual can have on the course of history. It also helps separate the authentic historical context from later mythologizing and doctrinal interpretation. 2. Non-Christian sources as independent confirmation. One of the strongest pillars supporting the historical existence of Jesus comes from non-Christian sources. These are accounts written by historians, chroniclers, and officials who had no vested interest in promoting Christianity. Their independent corroboration strengthens the argument for Jesus as a real historical figure. A. Tacitus. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century CE, is one of the most cited non-Christian sources. In his Annals, Tacitus describes how Emperor Nero blamed Christians for the fire of Rome in 64 CE and notes that their founder, Christus, suffered under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus' account is particularly valuable because he was openly critical of Christians, meaning he had no reason to fabricate the existence of their founder. His reference is considered one of the most reliable pieces of historical evidence for Jesus' crucifixion under Roman authority. B. Josephus. Josephus, a Jewish historian, provides another independent reference. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he mentions Jesus twice. The first, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man, a teacher, and a doer of marvelous works, who was crucified under Pilate. While scholars recognize that Christian scribes may have embellished the text, there is widespread agreement that the original passage referred to Jesus. The second reference mentions James as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, further supporting the existence of Jesus as a historical figure whose family and followers were known in Jewish society. See Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor in the early 2nd century, wrote to Emperor Trajan about early Christian communities. He notes that Christians worship Christ as a divine figure, meeting regularly for prayers and moral instruction. Pliny's letter is significant because it confirms that Jesus was not just a mythical concept, but a person whose followers actively practiced a faith centered on him, even decades after his death. D. Suetonius. Suetonius, another Roman historian, refers to disturbances caused by Chrestus during Emperor Claudius' reign. While the text is brief, scholars interpret it as an indirect reference to Christ and the social impact of his followers. This adds further evidence that Jesus' existence had real-world consequences observable by contemporaries outside Judea. These non-Christian sources converge to affirm that Jesus was a historical person. While they provide few details about his teachings or life, they corroborate his existence, his crucifixion, and the influence of his followers, a strong foundation for historical analysis. 3. Early Christian writings. While non-Christian sources are invaluable for independent verification, early Christian texts offer detailed accounts of Jesus' life, teachings, and death. These writings, particularly the letters of Paul and the Gospels, are essential for understanding both the historical figure and the earliest interpretations of his life. A. Paul's letters. Paul's epistles, written between approximately 50 and 60 CE, predate the Gospels by at least a decade or two. Paul references Jesus as a real person who lived, was crucified, an inspired movement that was spreading throughout the Roman world. He even mentions family connections and associates of Jesus, which historians interpret as evidence of a grounded historical figure. The letters demonstrate that within 20 years of Jesus' death, there was widespread belief in his life and message, lending credibility to his existence. B. The Gospels. The 4 canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were written between roughly 70 and 100 CE. Although theological in purpose, they contain rich historical detail. The Gospels describe first-century Jewish customs, Roman political structures, geography, and social conditions, aligning closely with archaeological and historical findings. Scholars critically examine the Gospels, comparing internal consistency and external corroboration to extract historically plausible facts. For example, the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is consistently reported and considered historically reliable, even if theological interpretations vary. 4. Archaeological and contextual support. Archaeology cannot directly prove the existence of Jesus, but it provides context that supports the plausibility of the gospel accounts. Excavations in Galilee, Jerusalem, and other parts of Judea reveal synagogues, Roman administrative buildings, and local customs that match descriptions in the New Testament. These findings confirm that the environment described in the Gospels was real, providing indirect support for the historical Jesus. Artifacts, inscriptions, and cultural practices help historians understand the social, political, and religious environment in which Jesus lived. For instance, the presence of Roman crucifixion practices, Jewish festivals, and Galilean towns matches the accounts of Jesus' life, demonstrating that the narratives are embedded in a recognizable historical setting. 5. Addressing mythicist claims. Despite the strong historical consensus, some argue that Jesus was a mythical figure, drawing parallels with earlier dying and rising gods like Osiris, Mithras, or Dionysus. While it is true that certain aspects of Christian narrative echo common mythological motifs, The mythicist theory is widely rejected by historians for several reasons. Multiple independent attestations. Unlike mythical figures, Jesus is referenced in multiple sources outside the Christian tradition. Specific historical context. Jesus is placed in a precise time, location, and political environment, making fabrication less plausible. Crucifixion. The invention of a crucified Messiah, a humiliating Roman punishment, would be unlikely if the intent was to glorify a purely mythical figure. Early witnesses. Paul and other early followers wrote within living memory of Jesus' life, further supporting historical existence. The convergence of these factors makes the argument for a historical Jesus compelling and robust. 6. Scholarly consensus. Modern scholarship, including historians who are not religious, overwhelmingly accepts Jesus as a historical figure. While debates continue about his exact teachings, miraculous claims, and theological interpretations, there is near universal agreement that Jesus of Nazareth existed. He was a Jewish teacher or preacher active in Galilee and Judea. He was crucified under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. His life inspired the early Christian movement that rapidly spread throughout the Roman Empire. The scholarly consensus reflects the weight of historical evidence and critical analysis, demonstrating that the question of Jesus' existence is settled within the academic community, even if theological debates continue. 7. The significance of recognizing the historical Jesus. Acknowledging Jesus as a historical figure is significant beyond mere academic curiosity. Understanding the historical Jesus allows us to separate myth from history. By distinguishing between theological claims and historical facts, we can critically examine the development of early Christianity and its teachings. Understand socio-political context. Jesus lived in a turbulent period under Roman occupation, where religious, political, and social tensions shaped his life and message. Recognizing this context provides insight into why his teachings resonated with certain groups. Trace the origins of a global movement. Early Christianity grew rapidly despite persecution, suggesting that the life and message of a real historical figure were central to its formation. Appreciate historical impact. Understanding Jesus historically shows how one person, through teaching, example, and martyrdom, could inspire profound cultural, religious, and social transformations. 8. Reconciling faith and history. For believers, recognizing the historical Jesus does not diminish faith, but rather complements it. Faith traditions can coexist with historical scholarship. One can study Jesus as a historical figure while also embracing theological beliefs about his divinity, miracles, or resurrection. Conversely, skeptics can acknowledge his historical existence without accepting supernatural claims. This dual approach allows for richer dialogue between faith and reason, history and spirituality. In conclusion, the historical evidence strongly supports the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a real person who lived in first-century Judea, preached a message that attracted followers, and was executed under Roman authority. Non-Christian sources such as Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny, and Suetonius, alongside early Christian writings like Paul's letters and the Gospels, converge to affirm his historicity. While debates about miracles, divine nature, and resurrection remain matters of faith, the existence of Jesus himself is widely accepted among scholars. Recognizing the historical Jesus allows us to separate myth from history and better understand how one individual could spark a movement that changed the course of human civilization. It illuminates the social, political, and religious conditions of first-century Judea, demonstrating that historical context matters when evaluating the origins of Christianity. It also highlights the profound human capacity for influence, showing how a single life, remembered and interpreted by others, can shape cultures and societies for millennia. By examining the historical evidence critically, we gain a fuller understanding of Jesus as both a historical figure and a source of enduring spiritual inspiration. Whether one approaches the topic from a religious, skeptical, or academic perspective, the convergence of sources makes the case for his existence compelling and robust. The historical Jesus, rooted in a specific time and place, remains a figure whose life, teachings, and legacy continue to resonate across the centuries, affirming his profound impact on human history. So, did Jesus really exist? The historical evidence, from Roman records to early Christian writings, strongly points to a real person who lived, taught, and was crucified in first-century Judea. While questions about his miracles and divine identity remain matters of faith, the fact of his existence is supported by multiple independent sources. Understanding the historical Jesus helps us see how a single life could inspire a movement that changed the world. If you found this exploration enlightening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to uncover more hidden truths from history and faith.